Sergeant Bruce Gogerly of 77 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force squeezed the trigger of his Gloucester Meteor F.8 at roughly 10,000 feet over Suncheon on December 1, 1951, and a MiG-15 flown by a Soviet pilot of the 176th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment came apart in front of him. The kill was logged in Australian records, but the aircraft was British. Designed at Hucklecote by George Carter, powered by two Rolls-Royce Derwent 8 engines, and delivered to Iwakuni under a Commonwealth arrangement brokered through the Air Ministry in London. Whitehall had spent the previous 18 months insisting the Meteor could hold its own against Mikoyan's swept-wing fighter. The claim was contested inside the Ministry of Supply, doubted by the Americans and quietly dreaded by the pilots who would have to prove it. The Meteor F-8 was the frontline interceptor of RAF Fighter Command in 1950. It had a straight wing, a top speed around 590 miles per hour at sea level, and a service ceiling that fell away sharply above 40,000 feet. The MiG-15 buys, powered by a Klymov VK-1, itself a reverse-engineered Rolls-Royce Nene, sold to Moscow by the Attlee government in 1946 in one of the more painful decisions ever taken at Millbank, could reach 50,000 feet and cruise faster than the Meteor could dive. On paper, the contest was settled before it began. The Air Ministry knew this. So did the Chiefs of Staff Committee, chaired that autumn by Field Marshal Sir William Slim. The Australians had asked for Sabres. They were told none were available. The Meteor's 94 airframes eventually delivered from Gloucester's Brockworth Line, and RAF stocks arrived in Japan in February 1951 and were worked up at Iwakuni through the spring. Wing Commander Dick Cresswell, commanding 77 Squadron, flew the type against a captured MiG-15 simulator profile and reported back to Melbourne and, through liaison, to the air staff at Adastral House. His conclusion was blunt. Above 25,000 feet, the Meteor could not fight the MiG. Below it, with careful handling, a pilot might survive. Might. The squadron's first engagement on August 29, 1951, cost them one aircraft. The second, on September 1st, cost them another. By the end of October, 5 Meteors had been shot down and the type was withdrawn from high-altitude escort work. In London, the Joint Intelligence Committee received a summary through the Air Ministry's Directorate of Operations that admitted, in careful civil service prose, that the Meteor was outclassed. The paper went to the Prime Minister's box. Clement Attlee read it on the eve of the general election that would put Churchill back in Downing Street. Then came Gogerly's kill, and a second claimed by Pilot Officer Bill Middlemiss the same day. Then a third on March 27th, 1953, when Sergeant John Hale of 77 Squadron shot down a MiG south of Sinmak. The Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, whose pilots flew most of the MiGs opposing United Nations aircraft in Korea, filed reports that reached Moscow and, through GCHQ's intercept station at Little Sai 1 in Hong Kong, London. The reports asked how a straight-wing Meteor, flying below its opponent, had put cannon rounds into a MiG-15 flown by a combat-experienced Guards Regiment pilot. The answer was not in the airframe. It was in what the British had done with it, and in what the Ministry of Supply, the RAF's Central Fighter Establishment at West Raynham, and a Rolls-Royce engineer named Adrian Lombard had worked out about the Meteor's cannon, its turn radius at specific altitudes, and the precise conditions under which a slower aircraft could kill a faster one. Whitehall had a theory. Iwakuni had proved it. Moscow wanted to know how. The theory began at Farnborough in the summer of 1949. The Royal Aircraft Establishment had obtained through the air attaché in Moscow, and a series of exchanges the Foreign Office preferred not to discuss, technical estimates of the MiG-15's performance envelope. The estimates were incomplete. What Farnborough did have was the airframe geometry, the engine, because it was theirs, and a working assumption about wing loading and control authority at altitude. From these, W.E.W. Petter's team and the aerodynamics department under Maury and Morgan built a comparative performance study that ran to 340 pages and was circulated within the Air Ministry under the reference AVIA 6/17832. The study reached a conclusion that surprised its authors. At altitudes below 20,000 feet, in a sustained turn, the Meteor F.8 could outradius the MiG-15. The Soviet fighter's swept wing gave it superior speed and climb, but at lower speeds and lower altitudes, the straight wing generated more lift per degree of angle of attack, and the aircraft could hold a tighter circle. The MiG's advantage was vertical. The Meteor's, such as it was horizontal. If a Meteor pilot could force the fight down to medium altitude and into a turning engagement, and if he could bring his 420mm Hispano Mark V cannon to bear for even half a second, the Soviet fighter would come apart. The Hispano fired at 750 rounds per minute per gun. A 1-second burst put roughly 50 rounds of 20mm high explosive into the target. The study was sent to the Central Fighter Establishment at West Raynham for tactical development. Squadron leader Peter Wycombe Barnes, later Air Marshal, worked through the profiles in the winter of 1949-50 and produced a tactical note that recommended a specific engagement pattern. Bounce from below, force the MiG into a descending turn and use the Meteor's cannon at close range. The note was classified secret and distributed to fighter command squadrons and through Commonwealth channels to 77 Squadron RAAF. Dick Creswell read it at Iwakuni in March 1951. He did not believe it. Neither did his pilots. The gap in engine performance was too great, and the MiG pilots, most of them the Australians correctly suspected Soviet, were flying with a confidence that suggested they knew exactly what their aircraft could do. Creswell asked the air staff in Melbourne for permission to fly a series of test engagements against captured MiG data at Iwakuni's altitude range. Permission was granted. The tests flown in April and May 1951 confirmed the Farnborough numbers within a small margin. What the tests could not confirm was the human factor. A Soviet pilot who kept the fight high and fast would never be caught. The Meteor's only chance was to be attacked to survive the first pass, and to draw the MiG down into the geometry where the straight wing worked. This required a specific kind of discipline. It also required the MiG pilot to make a mistake. The 64th Fighter Aviation Corps was commanded by Lieutenant General Georgy Lobov, a great patriotic war veteran with strong views on how his pilots should fight. Lobov's doctrine was aggressive. His pilots were instructed to close with United Nations formations, engage and press the attack. Against Sabres this worked. Against Meteors, particularly the Meteors of 77 Squadron, after Creswell's tactical revisions of July 1951, it created exactly the geometry Farnborough had predicted. A MiG-15 pressing home an attack on a Meteor at 20,000 feet, converting to a turning fight to finish the kill, entered the envelope in which the Meteor's 4 cannon could be brought to bear. Creswell did not tell the Americans, he did not tell the air staff in London either. He told his pilots. The signal traffic between Iwakuni, Melbourne and the Air Ministry in London through the autumn of 1951 is held at the National Archives at Kew under AIR 20/7898 and AIR 8/1697. It shows an Air Force learning in real time how to fly an aircraft it had not wanted against an aircraft it did not understand. The tone of the signals shifts through October and November. Losses continue. 3 Meteors down on October 24th, 1 on October 27th, 2 more in the first week of November. Then the pattern breaks. Sergeant Bruce Gogerly's kill on December 1st, 1951 was the first Meteor victory over a MiG-15. Gogerly was flying wingman to Flying Officer Jeff Thornton in a section of 4 Meteors, escorting a photo reconnaissance flight near Suncheon, when they were bounced by 12 MiGs of the 176th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment. Thornton called the break. Gogerly followed him into a descending starboard turn, saw a MiG overshoot, reversed and fired a 2-second burst from 250 yards. The MiG's port wing separated. Gogerly reported the kill on landing. The gun camera film was developed at Iwakuni that night and cabled to Melbourne. A copy went to the Air Ministry. The pilot Gogoli had killed was Captain Nikolai Shelomonov, an experienced pilot with combat time from earlier in the war. Soviet loss records released after 1991 and cross-referenced by the historian Diego Zampini and later by Igor Seidov confirmed the engagement. Shelomonov's regimental commander in his post-action report could not account for the loss. The Meteor was slower, it was flying below. Its cannon should not have been in range. The report reached the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps headquarters at Antung and, in summary form, Moscow. GCHQ's Little Sai-1 station in Hong Kong had been reading Soviet air defense traffic in Korea since early 1951. The intercepts were shared with the government communications headquarters at Eastcote and, through liaison, with the Air Ministry's Directorate of Signals Intelligence. The material was highly classified. Access was restricted under the strap compartment established in 1950, and its content was never briefed to Cresswell or his pilots. It was, however, briefed to the Joint Intelligence Committee, which reviewed Soviet air performance in Korea at meetings in December 1951 and February 1952. The JIC's assessment, drafted by the Air Ministry representative and approved by the chairman, Sir William Hayter, noted that Soviet pilots were reporting Meteor engagements with increasing frequency and that the reports contained expressions of tactical confusion. One intercept translated at Eastcote in early January 1952 quoted a Soviet regimental briefing at Antung in which the presenter admitted that the Meteor's low-altitude turning performance had been underestimated and that pilots were to avoid descending engagements with the type. The intercept was circulated to the Chiefs of Staff and to the Prime Minister. Churchill had returned to Downing Street on October 26, 1951. He read the Meteor material with interest. His private secretary, Jock Colville, recorded in his diary for January 14, 1952, that the Prime Minister had asked for a note on why the RAF had not sent Meteor squadrons to Korea itself. The answer provided by the Air Ministry through the Secretary of State for Air, Lord Delisle, was that Fighter Command was committed to the air defence of the United Kingdom against the Soviet long-range bomber threat, and could not spare front-line squadrons for Korea. Churchill accepted the answer. He also asked for the JIC's assessment to be shown to Field Marshal Sir John Harding, the incoming Chief of the Imperial General Staff. The Meteor was, in Whitehall's private view, being tested in Korea by proxy. What the Australians proved the RAF would use. The Rolls-Royce Nene affair had cast its shadow over every conversation about the MiG-15 since the aircraft had first been identified over the Yalu in November 1950. The Attlee government's decision in September 1946 to sell 25 Nene and 30 Derwent engines to the Soviet Union, approved by the President of the Board of Trade, Sir Stafford Cripps, and by the Cabinet against the private objections of the air staff, had put a British engine into the fighter now killing British and Commonwealth pilots. Ernest Bevin, Foreign Secretary, had reluctantly assented. Bevin's assumption, and Cripps's, was that the Soviets lacked the metallurgy to reverse engineer the centrifugal flow turbine. They did not. The Klimov VK-1 was a direct copy with slight enlargement of the Nene. Its production began at Kuibyshev in 1948. By the time Gogoli killed Shelomonov in December 1951, several thousand VK-1s were in Soviet service. The engine gave the MiG-15 a thrust-to-weight ratio the Meteor could not match, and every Meteor pilot who flew against a MiG in Korea was, in effect, flying against a British engine. The knowledge was not shared with the Australians at Iwakuni. It did not need to be. What was shared through Air Vice Marshal Sir Hugh Walmsley at the Air Ministry and through the Commonwealth Air Force's liaison staff was the accumulated tactical intelligence from West Raynham and from RAE Farnborough on how to fight a Nene-powered fighter with a Derwent-powered fighter. The Derwent-8 produced 3,600 pounds force of thrust. The VK-1 produced roughly 5,950. The gap was covered, if it could be covered at all, by pilot skill and by the Farnborough numbers on turning performance. Cresswell was replaced by Wing Commander Ron Susans in October 1951. Susans continued Cresswell's low-altitude doctrine. The squadron shifted from high-altitude escort to ground attack in December 1951, but retained an air-to-air role and continued to engage MiGs when the opportunity presented itself. Between December 1951 and the end of hostilities in July 1953, 77 Squadron was credited with the destruction of 5 MiG-15s and probable destruction of several more. Soviet records released after 1991 confirmed 3 of the kills unambiguously. The disparity is normal for air combat claims of the period. The squadron lost 32 Meteors to enemy action over the course of the war, most to ground fire during the shift to ground attack. 15 pilots were killed in action. The exchange ratio measured against MiGs alone was not favorable. Measured against the mission the Meteor was actually flown to accomplish, armed reconnaissance, close air support, and the denial of North Korean airspace at medium altitude, it was acceptable. What mattered in Whitehall was not the arithmetic, it was the demonstration. The Meteor F-8, an aircraft the air staff had privately assessed as obsolescent, had killed swept-wing Soviet fighters in combat. The tactical principles established at West Raynham and confirmed at Iwakuni had application beyond Korea. The RAF's fighter command, still equipped in 1952 with Meteors and Vampires, would face Soviet Tu-4 bombers, escorted by MiG-15s if the war in Europe came. The Korean data suggested that even the older British fighters could exact a price. The Air Ministry's Directorate of Operational Requirements used the Korean material to accelerate development of the Hunter and to refine the requirement that would produce the Lightning. The tactical notes went into the Central Fighter Establishment syllabus. The gun camera film from Gogoli's kill was screened at Bracknell for the Royal Air Force Staff College's 1952 course. Squadron leader Wycombe Barnes, promoted wing commander, gave the lecture. The lecture's title was Fighting the Inferior Aircraft. It did not name the aircraft. It did not need to. The Meteor's Korean War produced a second British contribution that has been less discussed in the public literature, but appears in the archival record with some prominence. This was the intelligence yield from the wreckage of MiG-15s recovered by United Nations forces in South Korea and North Korea, and the British role in the technical exploitation of those aircraft. The first substantially intact MiG-15 to fall into Western hands was the aircraft flown by Lieutenant No Kum-sok of the Korean People's Air Force, who defected to Kimpo Airfield on September 21, 1953. The aircraft was flown to Okinawa and evaluated by the United States Air Force. British participation in the evaluation was arranged through the Air Attaché in Washington, Air Vice Marshal Sir Douglas Macfadyen, and included a technical team from the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough under the direction of Handel Davies, then Deputy Director. The team's report, filed on return to Farnborough in December 1953, is held at Kew under AVIA 6/2-0441. The Farnborough team confirmed what had been suspected. The VK-1 was a direct derivative of the Neen, with modifications to the compressor and combustion chamber that indicated Soviet engineering competence had exceeded pre-1949 estimates. The airframe was well made, though with rougher surface finish than British production standards would have permitted. The cockpit ergonomics were poor. The gun sight was primitive. The 37mm and 223mm cannon were heavier hitting than the Meteor's 420mm Hispanos, but slower firing and with worse ballistic performance at range. More importantly, the Farnborough team was able to confirm the airframe's performance limits at altitude, and to correlate these with the tactical assumptions that had underpinned the West Raynham engagement doctrine. The correlation was close. The MiG-15's control authority degraded sharply above 45,000 feet, a fact the air staff had assumed but had not previously verified. The aircraft was unstable in yaw at high indicated airspeeds. Its cannon armament was optimized for bomber destruction, not fighter combat. Against a well-flown straight-wing fighter at medium altitude, in a turning engagement, its advantages were smaller than either side had believed. The Farnborough report was circulated within the Air Ministry and to the Joint Intelligence Committee. It was shared with the United States Air Force under the terms of the 1948 UK-USA Technical Intelligence Arrangements. It was not shared with the Australians at 77 Squadron, on the grounds that the war was over and the material was no longer operationally relevant. Cresswell, retired to Melbourne, learned the details only in the late 1980s. The Farnborough work had a further consequence. The knowledge that the MiG-15's high-altitude control limits were sharper than expected fed into the Air Staff's assessment of the Soviet fighter threat to the V-bomber force then being brought into service. If a MiG-15 or its successor could not maneuver effectively above 45,000 feet, then a Valiant or Victor flying at 50,000 feet had a substantially better chance of penetrating Soviet airspace than the pessimistic case had suggested. This assessment, revised through the 1950s as the MiG-17 and MiG-19 entered service, underpinned the Air Staff's confidence in the V-force deterrent through to the introduction of the Blue Steel standoff missile in 1963. The Meteor's kills over Korea then produced a chain of intelligence gains that ran from Iwakuni through Farnborough to Bomber Command's operations rooms at High Wycombe. The tactical demonstration was small. The intelligence dividend was large. Peter Hennessy has argued that the British nuclear deterrent of the 1950s rested on a set of unspoken assumptions about Soviet air defense performance. Some of those assumptions were assembled piece by piece from the wreckage the Meteor pilots had helped to create. The Meteor's operational life in RAF Fighter Command ended in 1957, when the last Meteor F.8 Squadron, 245 Squadron, at Stradishaw, converted to the Hunter. The aircraft continued in second-line roles, target towing, meteorological reconnaissance, night fighter work with the NF.14 variant, into the 1960s. Its combat reputation, made in Korea by pilots who were not British and not RAF, remained slightly awkward in Whitehall throughout. The awkwardness had several sources. The Air Staff had never wanted to admit that the RAF's frontline fighter of 1950 was obsolescent. The Ministry of Supply had spent public money on the Meteor's development into the F.8 variant as late as 1949, and had a departmental interest in defending the aircraft. The Australians had done the fighting and taken the credit. The Americans, whose sabres had achieved the great majority of MiG kills in Korea, had made little of the Meteor's contribution in their own literature. When the Air Ministry's official history of the RAF's post-war operations was drafted in the late 1950s under the direction of the Air Historical Branch, the Korean chapter was thin and the Meteor's role in it thinner still. What survived was in the operational research and in the tactical doctrine. The central fighter establishment at West Raynham and later at Binbrook retained the West Raynham engagement principles in modified form through the 1950s and into the Lightning era. The idea that an inferior fighter could kill a superior one by forcing the fight into a specific geometry became a staple of RAF fighter pilot training. It informed the tactics developed for the Hunter against the MiG-17 during the Yemen operations of 1957 to 59. And it informed the tactics briefed to Lightning pilots at RAF Wattisham and RAF Binbrook during the intercept exercises against Soviet Tu-95 aircraft that became routine from the mid-1960s. The doctrine had a further application in the training of RAF pilots, seconded to the Royal Saudi Air Force, and to other Middle Eastern air forces in the 1960s and 1970s. Meteors sold second-hand to a number of these air forces remained in service into the 1970s. The tactical notes went with them. The intelligence contribution, the confirmation of the MiG-15's high-altitude limits, and the assessment of Soviet aeronautical engineering competence had a longer reach. It fed into the JIC's annual assessment of the Soviet air threat, which was revised each year and briefed to the Prime Minister and to the Cabinet Defence Committee. The assessment underpinned decisions on V-bomber deployment, on the development of the Blue Steel and later Skybolt and Polaris programs, and on the RAF's air defence posture. Dennis Healey, appointed Secretary of State for Defence in October 1964, inherited an air defence policy shaped in part by the assessments the Meteor had helped to inform. The 1966 Defence White Paper, which announced the cancellation of the TSR-2's successor plans and the withdrawal from east of Suez, contained no reference to Korea. Its assumptions about Soviet air power, however, drew on a body of intelligence that included the Farnborough MiG-15 evaluation and the West Raynham tactical work. Christopher Andrew, in his Authorised History of the Security Service, has noted the way in which specific intelligence gains of the early Cold War fed into much later policy decisions in ways not always visible in the documentary record. The Meteor material is a case in point. It appears nowhere as a headline. It appears everywhere as an assumption. Bruce Gogerly retired from the RAAF as a squadron leader and returned to civilian life in Melbourne. He gave few interviews. The gun camera film of his December 1951 kill was declassified in the 1970s and can be viewed at the Imperial War Museum in London and at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. It runs for approximately 11 seconds. The wider British contribution to the air war over Korea has been under-recorded because it was under-visible. The RAF flew no squadrons in the theatre. Individual RAF pilots, however, served on exchange postings with United States Air Force units and with the Royal Australian Air Force. Between 1950 and 1953, approximately 40 RAF pilots flew combat missions in Korea. Several flew Sabres with USAF units. Several flew Meteors with 77 Squadron. At least 4 flew both. Flight Lieutenant John Nichols, later Air Chief Marshal Sir John Nichols, flew Sabres with the 335th Fighter Interceptor Squadron of the USAF's 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing in 1952 and was credited with 2 MiG-15 kills. Flight Lieutenant Graham Hulse, flying Sabres with the 336th FYS, was killed in action on March 13, 1953. Squadron leader W.H. Paddy Harbison flew Sabres with the 4th FIW and was credited with 1 MiG kill. These pilots reported back to the Air Ministry on return, and their debriefs, held at Kew under AIR 20 series, contained detailed observations on MiG performance and Soviet pilot tactics. The debriefs were assembled by the Directorate of Operational Requirements and cross-referenced with the Farnborough technical work and the West Raynham tactical development. The picture that emerged by mid-1953 was more detailed than any other Western Air Force possessed. The Americans had greater volume of engagement data. The British had a more analytical framework for interpreting it. The two were combined at various working group meetings held at the Pentagon and at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base through 1953 and 1954. One outcome of this combination was the development, by the RAF and the USAF working jointly, of a set of tactical principles for fighter versus fighter combat in the jet age. These principles formalized in the RAF's air publication 3456, Fighter Combat, issued in 1955, and in the USAF's parallel doctrine documents, drew heavily on the Korean experience. They emphasized energy management, the importance of the initial bounce, and the tactical value of a fighter's specific excess power at the altitude of engagement, a concept that would be formalized in the 1960s by the American theorist John Boyd, but that had British antecedents in the work done at Farnborough and West Raynham in the early 1950s. The Meteor's specific contribution to this doctrine was its role as a test case. The aircraft's demonstrated ability to kill a superior fighter under specific conditions provided a data point that could not otherwise have been generated. Fighter Command's exercises through the 1950s incorporated the lesson. Aggressor squadrons flying obsolescent types were used to train Lightning pilots in the awareness that an inferior enemy, well flown, remained dangerous. The lesson had application beyond the RAF. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm, operating Seahawks and later Scimitars from HMS Eagle and HMS Ark Royal in the late 1950s, drew on the Meteor material for its own fighter doctrine. The Suez operation of November 1956 saw Fleet Air Arm aircraft engage Egyptian Air Force MiG-15s and MiG-17s on the ground, and, in a small number of cases, in the air. The tactical assumptions were those developed from the Korean experience. The one Fleet Air Arm air-to-air kill of the Suez campaign, a Seahawk of 897 Naval Air Squadron from HMS Eagle destroying an Egyptian MiG on the ground at Al-Mazar, was not a fighter versus fighter engagement, but the tactical positioning was informed by the Korean tactical framework. The Meteor pilots of 77 Squadron had, without knowing it, contributed to the tactical education of a generation of British fighter pilots, and to the intelligence picture that shaped British defence policy through the height of the Cold War. The contribution was small, unglamorous, and largely anonymous. It was also real. The last MiG-15 in first-line Soviet service was withdrawn in the mid-1960s. The type continued in Chinese, North Korean, and various client state air forces into the 1970s and 1980s. The Meteor F.8, retired from RAF Fighter Command in 1957, was operated by the air forces of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Egypt, Israel, Syria, Argentina, Brazil, and Ecuador into the 1970s. 2 former Egyptian Meteors were destroyed on the ground by Israeli aircraft at El Arish on June 5, 1967. The aircraft's operational life spanned the whole of what the British Chiefs of Staff called, in the classified assessments of the mid-1950s, the primary Cold War period. The Farnborough technical assessment of the MiG-15, updated through the 1950s as further examples became available for study, remained the baseline British intelligence document on Soviet fighter engineering until it was superseded in the mid-1960s by the assessment of the MiG-21, itself informed by an Iraqi defector's aircraft delivered to Israel in August 1966 and made available to British and American intelligence through joint arrangements. The chain of technical intelligence work that began with the Nini sale in 1946 and continued through the Korean recoveries and the No-Kum-Sok defection ran, in unbroken form, into the assessments that shaped RAF operational planning for the 1970s. Peter Hennessy has written that the British Cold War was fought at 2 levels: the visible level of alliance politics, defence budgets, and public deterrent posture, and the invisible level of intelligence work, technical assessment, and the quiet exchange of information between allies. The Meteor's Korean War belongs to the invisible level. Its contribution appears in no cabinet paper, in no defence white paper, in no public speech by a Secretary of State. It appears in the JIC papers, in the Farnborough technical reports, in the West Raynham tactical notes, and in the intercept summaries from Little Sai-1. Sir Michael Howard, writing in the 1980s on the intellectual history of the Cold War, observed that the period's decisive contests were often fought by small numbers of specialists in obscure technical fields. The engineers at Farnborough who reduced No-Kum-Sok's MiG-15 to its component performance data, the tactical thinkers at West Raynham who worked out how to fight it, the intercept operators at Little Sai-1 who read what the Soviets were saying about it, and the Australian pilots at Iwakuni who tested the theory in combat, formed a chain of expertise that connected a small air campaign in a peripheral war to the central assessments of British defence policy. Bruce Gogerly died in 2014. His obituary in the Melbourne Age described him as the first Commonwealth pilot to shoot down a MiG-15 in a Meteor. The obituary did not mention the Farnborough study, the West Raynham tactical notes, the JIC assessments, or the intercept traffic. Gogerly, in his own account given to the RAAF historical section, in 1998, said only that he had done what his training told him to do, and that he had been surprised the aircraft had come apart so quickly. He credited the Meteor's 4 cannon. He did not know about the Nene. The Air Ministry's records at Kew, opened progressively under the 30-year rule from 1981 onwards, allow the full picture to be reconstructed. The picture is one of a British defence establishment that used a peripheral conflict, a foreign air force and a small number of engineers and pilots to generate intelligence and tactical knowledge of disproportionate value. Whitehall did not celebrate the Meteor's kills. Whitehall used them. The finest hours of the British Cold War were often fought this way.